guys, welcome back. Today is lecture 12, and we are going to be asking ourselves, were the Dark Ages truly dark? So we talked about what kind of the Roman Empire was like right after it fell, but then we started talking about Christianity, Islam, we talked about the Franks and the Vikings, but I want to talk to you also about just the general culture of the Dark Ages. This is the early medieval times, so it's kind of interesting to think if it was a dark time where, like, we had the ancient Greeks lose literacy. Was it like that, or was it still a time of a lot of progress? It just looked different. That's our question for today, and that's going to be your homework assignment. I have a reading too that goes along with this, so let's get started. First, I want to talk to you about the culture of the Dark Ages. We have feudalism and manorialism. So, feudalism is this idea that kings will give warriors land in exchange for support. This is also called a fiefdom. So, we have a lord, that is the land giver, and a vassal, which is the land receiver. This type of situation is supposed to be that the lord or the king takes care of the people that are lower in exchange for the people that are lower taking care when necessary for the king. And this was a time of feudal anarchy, and anarchy means lawlessness. So, unlike the Roman Empire, where there was one emperor that ruled all of this place, there were lords that answered to a king, but the kings were always changing. For example, when we talked about Clovis and Charlemagne, they conquered areas that didn't have any clear ruler. So it was hard sometimes to know who was in charge of you and who to protect. And we call this the manorial system of economics, where you get land from the nobles or the lords. But as a result, not only do the warriors have to protect, but the peasants have to give crops back to the king. If you remember the French Revolution, this is an issue, right? When a king is greedy and says to give me taxes or give me your, like, corn or wheat, that sometimes can leave the peasants with not much. So if you were a lord, you may have lived comfortably, but if you were a peasant, you probably didn't have a very good life. Here is a rendition of all of this. So we have here a king that is knighting a person, so giving him an official sword. He's an official knight. So the knight has to protect the king, and the king is going to give the knight some land. This is that idea of the feudalism. And this is the idea of, like, the farmer instead of the knight. So we have people that are going to be planting wheat, planting seeds. Up here is our castle, where we see other people doing different jobs. And there's various levels of protection, okay? The people inside of the walls have the most protection. The people out here have the most to lose. If there's an invasion, they're going to be the first ones being attacked. And it wasn't a good situation to be in. Some of these people in the wintertime, especially, because a lot of Europe gets cold in the wintertime, they would bring their animals into their house and sleep surrounded by, like, cows and pigs, because the cows and pigs had body heat. So, as you can imagine, it's not a very sanitary time. Because that it's not a sanitary time, people they don't really drink water. People would just drink a version of beer, because the beer could be sterilized, like the alcohol would sterilize it. Think about, like, rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer. So not only were these people suffering to own nothing. They didn't own any of this land, they just had to work it. But they didn't have water to drink, and they didn't have any heat. It wasn't a really great time to be a peasant. This could be considered a dark time. But there was also a new lifestyle, okay? Catholicism is on the rise. Pope Gregory I takes charge, and he uses his authority. Pope Gregory was the one that sent St. Augustine of Canterbury to England. Pope Gregory starts to say, in order to be a good Catholic, you need to spread the word of Catholicism. So these people would go into, whoever knows, the Vikings were attacking all the time. These people didn't have a lot, and they would go and either start a monastery or they would go and try to get into these fiefs, okay? So if you were a Benedictine monk, you might try to live on the outskirts of this area to convince the people living there that they should be Catholic, not just Christian Catholic. Remember, all Catholics are Christians, but not all Christians are Catholics. Okay. We also see a change in sexuality. The Benedictine idea of self-discipline meant no sex until you were married. And we see the first condemnation of homosexuality, which is pretty interesting considering, well, if we look back to Rome, this was not the case. We look back to any period from the classical Greeks, the ancient Greeks, the classical Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks. It wasn't as important back then, but as the Benedictine monks, they want more order. They don't want you talking too much. They don't want you laughing too much. And they don't want there to be sex before marriage. There's also the idea of children, and children have to control the natural inclination to sin. I just love that idea. The idea is that children will sin, and they need to be more pure in order to not. Okay. But it wasn't all bad in the Benedictine orders. The one thing is, monasteries became like hotels. So you could travel now. If you were, for example, St. Augustine going to Canterbury, remember, he didn't want to go. He wrote all these letters back to Pope Gregory saying, please don't make me go to England. Well, now that monasteries are set up, you could go. And if we remember Hellenistic Greece, traveling helps spread knowledge. So if a monastery in, let's say, Burgundy in France discovered a way to treat headaches, one of those monks might go on a trip to Milan in Italy and then tell those monks how to treat headaches. The lifestyle they also had, like I said, is bread and mead. Mead is not the same as beer. It is, well, it can be a little bit stronger. I went to Ireland and I was offered mead, but I didn't drink it because it smelled really disgusting. And I don't know if I should say, but there's a little like rhyme about mead. It was, one mead will have you seeing double, and 2 meads will have you feeling single. So it was pretty strong. And the health also during this time, not great. Like I said, these peasants, not necessarily the Benedictine monks, but I'm sure some of them in certain cult situations, the peasants would be sleeping in the same house with their cows and pigs. As you can imagine, it would smell really disgusting. It would be really disgusting. And one way that people in the Dark Ages had to, I don't know, do medicine was called bloodletting. And it was basically just making you bleed. They would just think that if you lost enough blood, that would let the bad thing out. So if you were like throwing up a lot, if you had food poisoning or dysentery where you can't stop pooping, they would like cut you open and then you would have a controlled bleed where like someone would watch you. A quote unquote doctor might watch you and just watch you bleed, and that would help the virus get out. Um, that didn't work. I think it goes without saying that didn't work. Another thing is this update on monasticism. Last time we left monasticism, we were talking about the Benedictine monks and the idea of you're not talking, you're not laughing. And this wasn't the only way that there was monasteries. Not all monasteries were Benedictine. Some of them were just regular monasteries. And this is where we first see the idea of a university. There was now degrees and coursework. So, for example, you are partaking in coursework right now. You have to take this class in order to take a 300 level, maybe even a 200 level class. Coursework means the steps you have to take to get a higher degree. For example, I have a master's degree, but I needed a bachelor's degree before I could get a master's degree. So, in addition to making coursework, they design universities that we still use today. And if we were in person, I would have you look around and you'd see we look just like this. I am this guy at the front, and these are all of my students. And at high school, it's not really like that, but once we're on campus again for the university, you'll see this is exactly what my lecture hall looked like. I was at the front at like a podium, and then there were rows of seating, and all of these people are just listening, just like you guys are listening now. This all happened during the Dark Ages. So again, are we going to say the Dark Ages were dark if universities started? Another really cool thing is that we start to have what's called illuminated manuscripts. So parts of the Bible or parts of just stories wouldn't be just copied down. They would be kind of improved upon. There'd be more art. And we have something called the Book of Kells, which is one of the oldest, like, still surviving physical books. It's from around the year 800 CE or AD, and it is found in Trinity College in Dublin. And whoops, this is me. I went there. This is Trinity College, and I saw the Book of Kells. It was really cool because it has a lot of ornate detail in art. So this all also started during this time. One thing we might say, though, for the Dark Ages being dark is certainly the idea of justice and torture. This is always my students' favorite topic. I know it sounds really messed up, but it's really cool. So, if you were accused of a crime, there are a couple different ways that they could find your innocence. And that was called a trial by ordeal. So, if I was accused of stealing, let's say I was accused of stealing a lot of money or silver from a monastery, my lords, so the people that, again, are inside of the castle in charge of the fief, would have me do a test to see if I really did steal something. If I denied it, there'd have to be a trial by ordeal. So our first ordeal is the ordeal of hot water, where the accused would dip his hand into a kettle of boiling water to retrieve a stone. If he did not get burned, then he was innocent, and if he got burned, then he was guilty. The next is an ordeal by millstone, sometimes just called the ordeal of water. And with a stone around your neck, the accused would be thrown into a river or lake. If you sank and drowned, then you were guilty, and if you could float, then you were innocent. The next is really interesting. It's called the ordeal of the cross, and the accuser and the accused would both hold out their arms, stretched out their arms like a cross, and the first one to drop their arm was the guilty one. So just imagine how long you could stand with your arms like up. It would be pretty hard. And the last one was called the ordeal of bread, or the ordeal of indigestion, which was you would be given really dry bread and cheese, and if you choked, you were guilty. So, yeah. The next that I want to talk about is torture. Torture. Why would you torture? Well, one would be to get you to confess a crime. Second, to give information on a crime. Or three would be punishment for a crime. And believe it or not, this was not abolished until 1640, which is around the time of John Locke. So this whole time, there has been tortured. And some are to fit the crime where there's no death, and some is for death. So the first is called the brank, and it was to humiliate gossipers. If you were talking too much, they would put this around you for you to humiliate you, make you feel bad. The next is called the drunkard cloak, and this was if you were day drinking, and if you were just a shameful drunkard, you would have to wear a barrel. That's where the alcohol was, in the barrel. And these are, again, not to kill you, to humiliate you. But now, let's get to the killing ones. The first is called the rack, which you would basically be stretched until your arms and legs were dislocated or the muscles tore. Next is the scavenger's daughter, where you would crouch down and they would put you into a circle, like a hoop. Think of like a hula hoop that kept getting tighter and tighter until I'm guessing you would just not be able to breathe anymore. Or yeah, what probably would kill you would be the not breathing well. I don't think would kill you by being uncomfortable. As you can imagine, it would be pretty uncomfortable and a lot of pressure. So you might have bruised and torn muscles or bones before you end up just can't breathe anymore. The next is water. This is a funnel, and they would basically open your mouth and put the funnel in and drown you by pouring water into your mouth. Next is the wheel. This is probably one of my favorite ones. I don't favorite seems like wrong to say, but as you can imagine, it would be a pretty long, torturous death. You're on this wheel and someone is cranking it over hot coals. So the trick here is that you have to do it slowly. So this person their whole face would be in these hot coals on their body, their torso, their stomach, their legs, and then they'd be up and they could take a breath and they would have some fresh air, and then back upside down into fire they go. And you just keep rotating them until they die. Next is the pear of anguish. This is probably my least favorite one. It looks like a pear like a pear and a wine opener. They would put this into your throat and twist it, and it would make you choke or it would break your throat. It was really unpleasant. It was not good. Not that any of these are pleasant necessarily. The next is my second favorite, the brazen bull. It was this is horrible. It was a bronze bull, and there would be a little door on the side of the bull. The person would go in, and the only way out, the only air, is the nostrils of the bull, which you guys can see here. So this person would be inside of the bull, metal, while a fire would be under it, and it would just get hotter and hotter, and you could just imagine just the horribleness of touching something hot by accident, but it's your whole body and it's metal and you can't really breathe. This is really unpleasant. Again, not that any of them are really pleasant. The next is the gibbet. This was very slow, tortured death. So you would be in this kind of contraption up on the ceiling and basically be there until you died. So that could be you died from not eating or drinking, but the really gross thing about this one is that was actually not the most common way to die. The most common way is that like birds and bugs and stuff would eat you alive because you couldn't move your hand and like swat them away. Yeah, not good. And the last is the Iron Maiden. This you stand inside and they just close it on you. And the really gross thing is there's a little like slit at the bottom for all of the blood to pool out. So you would go in there and have these spikes in your face and your stomach, and you wouldn't die right away because it would, as long as there's something in the wound, it would be stopping the blood from like pouring out. So you might be stuck with these things in you for like a couple hours before you died. So, have I convinced you that the Dark Ages were dark yet? Well, just in time for me to convince you that they weren't dark. The last thing that we're going to talk about today, and what you have a reading on, is the architecture from the Dark Ages. You would think during this time of cruelty and torture that art would kind of stop. There wouldn't be any more beautiful art. Well, that is actually not the case. The architecture during this time is really, really interesting. You have beautiful stained glass. Stained glass was for a couple different reasons. The first was to tell stories of the Bible for people who were illiterate. The second was to make this kaleidoscopic colors in the cathedral, which, as you can imagine, if you were a person that slept in a one-room house with pigs and cows all day, then you walked into this, it would be really, really cool. So when I say cool, I mean it's to show the majesty of God, essentially. The next interesting thing is the actual inside of the buildings, which is what you guys are going to be reading about, and I think the architecture, a lot of you will find it interesting. So it's like a 2-page read, not too bad. But the interesting thing is, kind of like the Mesopotamian ziggurats, the idea was the higher your cathedral could be, the higher, the closer it was to God, the more holy it was. And so there were these really modern feats of architecture to make buildings as high as they could be, but also as made of glass as they could be. And medieval people did this by utilizing archways and also a couple different architectural skills. The first is a flying buttress. This is a support to the outside of a cathedral. Here's a person for size. And you can imagine it's just kind of holding things up. It's like scaffolding, it's support for a building. And this is me at the Notre Dame in France, and I'm right here in the back by the flying buttresses. The next thing is the ribbed vault ceilings. Believe it or not, these, I don't know how to describe them really. Just like these changes in the ceilings. These are called ribbed vaultings, and they provide more structural support than a regular ceiling. So you can, again, build something taller and stronger if you utilize this system of vaulting. And if any of you guys are any engineering kind of people, maybe you've heard that the triangle is one of the strongest shapes. A lot of suspension bridges, regular bridges, they utilize triangles because of the way that load can be carried on a triangle. So these ribbed vaultings utilize the triangle shape, and so did the archways. So where an archway in Rome would have been round, we have these kind of pointed archways, which utilizes the shape of a triangle for more support, the pointed arch. Here's another look. We have the barrel vault, which was, again, how it was in Rome. And then we have the rib vault, which utilizes those panelings to make something stronger. And there's a couple different, the last couple things I'm going to talk about is the symbolism. Like I said, the first is about literacy. The stained glass was to help those who couldn't read visit the cathedrals and to feel the presence of God. The interesting thing too is that even if you could read like English or French, granted it was Old English, yes, the Bible was written in Latin or Hebrew. So even if you were illiterate, you might not be able to read the Bible. Well, you would not be able to read the Bible unless you were a monk, which becomes an issue later, a couple hundred years later. So we'll get to that. The next is the symbolism of the cross. Some of these cathedrals, you can kind of see it here, are built to be like a cross. So you have the beams this way, and then you have the front, which you can't really see, and then the longer end of the cross there. And the symbolism of the cross, of course, is that Jesus died on the cross. And the last is the square in front. I don't mean an actual square, I mean like a square marketplace. Like I said, if you couldn't read Latin, going in, and even if you couldn't understand Latin, going in and listening wasn't really the most important thing of a cathedral. It was going in and experiencing the beauty, the majesty, and the squares in the front become a place for people to congregate, to talk about things, to sell things. So just like we have the Parthenon in classical Greece, the squares of a cathedral become kind of a meeting central place. So again, my question to you is, were the Dark Ages truly dark? And I'm going to leave this open because this is our homework assignment. So I will talk to you guys next lecture.